Karima Brown. It's Sunday and it's time for The Fix. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold those in power to account. We tell you what matters, how it affects you, and why you should care. Now, the Nugent Commission of Inquiry laid bare the systematic hollowing out of one of democratic South Africa's most effective institutions and its replacement with people and processes that had left SARS still limping, despite the sacking of former SARS head Tom Moyane and his replacement by Edward Kieswetter. The issue that set it all off was, of course, the hounding out of Mr. Ivan Pillay, who stood accused of setting up a rogue unit. All lies, of course, carefully fabricated in an elaborate plot to capture the institution. Today, Pillay is the subject of a book titled The Unlikely Mr. Rogue, My Life with Ivan Pillay, written by investigative journalist Evelyn Groenek. Ivan Pillay now joins me in the studio. Ivan, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Fix. It's a real pleasure to have you. I must tell you, I finished this book in one sitting. It was a difficult read, quite hard in many instances, but I want to focus on three main themes, one of which is, of course, the question around, building a capable state. And you make the point in your interviews with the author, Evelyn, that we inherited very little when we, had the democratic breakthrough in 1994. Most people who were in the state were either collaborators, but many people came from mass democratic organizations out of exile. What was the most important thing for you when you joined SARS? What was the most important system that needed to be put down for that organization to become, the kind of exceptional, efficient organization by the time you had exited there?
I don't know if it's a system, but the very first thing I think that we got right is that each one of us had a purpose in our lives. And we found a purpose in SARS. Minister Gordhan talks about a higher purpose. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us that come from the liberation movement, from the liberation struggle, we were quite determined to succeed. We knew that a democratic government would need funding to make its programs achievable. And that is what drove us. Now, the purpose is, of course, not just enunciated or written on a piece of paper. It informs the criteria for recruitment of people. It informs the way you do your work. It informs quite naturally that you would be very sensitive to the taxpayers' feelings and the responses of taxpayers. It also talks to the fact that although you have to enforce certain things, you will be fair in what you do.
Yeah.
So this thing permeates the institution.
One of the things that I picked up in the postscript is basically your notes on, the lessons that you've learned at a civil service. And you talk about this higher purpose, but you also talk about how one assesses a person that you recruit. And I'm always reminded of a fantastic example that former Constitutional Court Justice Johan Kriegler says. He always says to us, if you look at process alone, if you look at the current public protector, that process was perfectly fine. It went through Parliament. We all watched it. It was incredibly transparent. But did we get the right person? And in your book, you talk about not just what the person says in the moment at the interview. You talk about patterns of behavior. Now, I mean, that is really an important issue. We've seen, for example, at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry currently, where patterns of behavior actually indicates to you that someone who might come across well in an interview, meet the bill, tick all the boxes, is actually perhaps a highly unsuitable person, because over a period of time, that person's behavior tells us something about that person. When you look at what happened when you left SARS, do you think that we looked enough at the patterns of behavior so that we could anticipate how that organization was actually eventually almost destroyed?
I think during our time, and it took us quite some time, I think it's not like we knew all of these things when we started there. Amongst values, one of the values that we must treasure is an eagerness to learn. And a lot of us had that eagerness. And we learned very fast. And we were never shy to say, we do not know. So there is a measure of an activist approach to things. But there's also a measure that as we were doing it, we reviewed and we learned from our mistakes. So we got better and better at the recruitment of people. But let me say firstly, the recruitment of people is not an easy thing. It's a difficult thing. To make a call on human nature when you only see the best part of a person for an hour and a half to 2 hours, it's very difficult.
Yes.
So top organizations take a long time over recruitment. And they may have more than 2 or 3 interviews. And then they'll have a battery of assessments. Over time, we began to develop this in SARS. We still had a long way to go, but over time we got better and better at it. So we would send people for a battery of assessments, and we would set store by the battery, in the sense that it's not automatic if the battery says no, no, or yes, yes. But if you had to go against the recommendation of the battery of tests, you had to give reasons. You couldn't just ignore it. I believe that's one of the first things that happened when we were thrown out. They ignored totally the battery of tests.
So when you talk also about reviewing people, you place a lot of emphasis also on peer reviews, so that it's not just a kind of top-down structure, that your peers actually review you. When you look at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, I mean, we've sat through some horrifying testimonies of really senior people where the Chief Justice implored these individuals. I remember with Ms. Kwinana, the Chief Justice kept on saying, you know, Ms. Kwinana, you are a chartered accountant, you are a professional. How can you not remember the address where you, you conducted your business at, where you live? And of course, it comes back to the question that we are accountable to each other. We make an oath of service to the people to uphold the Constitution when we instate institutions. How soon after you left did you see the peer review system just vanishing? Because I remember interviewing Mr. Luther Labello on how Mr. Makwakwa, for example, was not spotted as someone who was behaving badly, even though the FIC had picked up irregular payments into his accounts, for example. Why did his peers not pick up if the peer review system, was in place? I mean, he was deputy of SARS.
Yeah, so look, so again, there's the issue of, first there's a value that says, I'm accountable. People shouldn't be forced to account. There must be a willingness to account. Or, let me put it another way, the way you do things should not be about avoiding accountability. So I think that is a requirement. But more than that, it is how you design into everyday activity, into your systems, this peer review. So the way it is done is for example, the formal way is that once or twice a year we would do a performance review. And part of the performance review is that your peers would review you, and you'd get the results, but you wouldn't know which peer reviewed and gave you which results. So we would do a 360 degrees thing. But as you get into that, you've got to inculcate it into your everyday things. Now, what's very important, usually in order to deliver anything, when you're talking about a complex organization, you can't deliver it, everything, from start to finish to the end product, all yourself. You depend on inputs from somebody else. So you design all of those things in such a way that people know, listen, I'm dependent on this one for my inputs, and my output is somebody else's input. Okay? So you then start to see how you all fit together. Okay? So for example, if I were to use an example of the criminal justice system, the efficiency of the police impacts on the efficiency of the prosecution.
Yeah.
Impacts on the efficiency of prisons. Okay? And one individual in the front office of a police station takes a statement incorrectly, impacts all the way around. So when we're talking about peer review, what we're actually talking about is a bigger issue. Is that there will always be a tendency in an organization for humans to be narrow, because in that way you feel you got control. So you always try and narrow your activity. So to the extent that we can be good at managing, we are, some of us, good at managing the vertical downwards. Okay. We have great difficulty in managing this. We have great difficulty in managing somebody who's not a subordinate. Okay. Now, why is it important to manage that? That is because if you're not able to do that, your organization fragments, because you're just going to have pipes running, silos in an organization, and that's very, very important. And so if you're talking about South Africa, you're talking about the state. So if you talk within SARS, there might be like 10 silos that need to be pulled together. And integrated. Right. But if you're talking about the state as a whole, you're talking about hundreds of silos. So it's an important part of overcoming fragmentation. It's not the most important part, but an important part is how we manage the horizontal. Absolutely. And that, of course, Ivan, relies a lot on leadership, which is, of course, what we're going to return to. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we talk about how to best safeguard the democratic project through ethical leadership. Don't go anywhere.